All right, and welcome everyone to our second graduate program webinar series for the Department of History here at Sam Houston State University. My name is Dr. Benjamin Park. I have the privilege of being the Director of Graduate Studies here. In a moment, you're going to hear a bit of background for today's guest lecturer, but right now I want to tell you a bit about the series. This series is part of our department's desire to cultivate the ideological and intellectual engagement among our faculty and graduate students, and even those pretentious undergraduate students who like to participate too. This lecture will therefore be recorded and be available to our graduate students on demand. A few things of department business, just so you are all aware. First, for today, note that if you want to ask a question, the best way to do that is if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button that has two little comment bubbles next to it. If you click that, that'll bring up a separate window in which you will type your question for Dr. Laite. If you'd like to, you can also go through and look at the other questions people have asked and like or upvote those questions so we can know which ones are most pressing. After Dr. Laite finishes her presentation, Dr. Sarah Mass will be moderating the Q&A. So make sure to get your questions in so that they can be addressed in the Q&A feature. The other point of business is that we will be having one more lecture in our webinar series. That lecture will take place the evening of Wednesday, August 4th at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we will be privileged to have Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, a university professor at Harvard University and author of her most recent book. She's written a few, but her most recent book is On Juneteenth, which is a part Texas history and part personal memoir of race relations in Texas. And it's a wonderful book. And she will be our final lecture on August 4th at 7 p.m. Like this event and like our first event, you need to pre-register for it. I will include the pre-registration link in the chat function. So if you look at the chat function, do yourself a favor, just register now so you don't have to worry about it again, although I will be bugging you with emails later on. That's all I have for preparation. So I am going to pass the digital mic over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Sarah Mass, our expert in British history, who will be introducing our guest speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Park. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Julia Laite today. Dr. Laite is a reader in modern history at Birkbeck College, University of London. She received her PhD from the University of Cambridge, where her doctoral dissertation formed the basis of her first book, Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens, Commercial Sex in London, 1885 to 1960. In the meantime, Dr. Laite has become a sort of figurehead in public history and sort of conversations between academia and public history in Britain. She's the director of the Bishopsgate Institute in London, and she also serves on the editorial board for History Workshop Journal. Both of these institutions are important sort of mouthpieces and sounding boards for issues about public engagement, history and history making in Britain. She's also published on these issues in the Journal of Social History and History Workshop Journal, where her recent articles have really sort of thrown down the gauntlet to academic historians, inviting us to think more reflectively about our methods and our positionality in an era where, in particular, digitization has seemingly made the historical record available to us at our fingertips. And I think that she has thrown up some interesting sort of questions about that. And we might hear a bit more about that in her talk. And if you have sort of questions about your own research using digital archives, using your own family history, Dr. Laite is an incredible resource for those issues, and I urge you to ask her questions about that in the Q&A. So as I was reading the disappearance of Lydia Harvey this weekend, I started to get a bit overwhelmed about how to contextualize this book and talk about its contribution. And that's not necessarily because I had no sort of ideas about what to do. There were, in fact, too many ideas. There were too many things in my head. I thought I could sort of go the historiographical route, talk about its contribution to the history of sex work, labor history, women's history, the history of crime and policing. I could also go the methodological route, talking about family history, digital history, public history, all of which I think are there in its pages. But in the end, and perhaps this is sort of a cop-out, I reverted to what I know best, and that's the history of 20th century Britain. But really that was prompted by content I was reading on the page, and in particular, a date that kept sort of coming up both in the text and in the footnotes, and that is 1910. So if you don't know much about 20th century British history, and I know many of you do not, 1910 is a formative year in the sort of historical trajectory of modernity in Britain. In 1924, novelist Virginia Woolf wrote that on or about December 10th, 1910, human nature changed. Now, she was speaking specifically about an post-impressionist art exhibition at the Grafton Galleries in London, where sort of stodgy art history of the Victorian period was giving way to modernity in London. The sort of modern age had dawned. But historians have really used events of 1910 to talk far beyond the art historical world. This was the year, for example, that Edward VII died. This was the end of the Edwardian period in Britain. There were 2 general elections that were held in 1910 that really rocked the foundation of the political consensus in the nation. There was a very visible march on London led by militant suffragettes. There were also sort of the stirrings of radical trade unionism. Tom Mann, who was an important trade union syndicalist, wrote The Way to Win. So there are all these sort of fomenting ideas and events that are happening in this one year. And since Virginia Woolf sort of commented on that, historians, most notably Peter Stansky, who is a sort of major figure in the field, has used 1910 to think about the sort of dawn of the modern age in the nation. So the year has exerted an immense amount of analytical sort of control, a hold over our imagination. This is when the 19th century Victorian Britain ended and when modernity began. But what Julia Laite has given us is a truly new way of thinking about 1910. The linchpin event in this year isn't the death of a monarch or a surprising vote share in a general election or even a mass demonstration. It is a criminal case, but perhaps more importantly, it is a written testimony. In the summer of 1910, 2 Italian nationals, Antonio Carvelli and Alessandro de Nicotera, were brought before the Old Bailey Court in London in a case of sex trafficking, which by the letter of the law was procuring for the purposes of prostitution any girl or woman under the age of 21, not being a common prostitute or of known immoral character. And those words are important, and I'm sure we will recognize the importance of those words in the talk. The key witness in this case was a 16-year-old from New Zealand by the name of Lydia Harvey, although her name was hidden during the trial. And in Julia Laite's hands, Harvey becomes the new linchpin of the modern world. So it's not post-impressionists, and it's not politicians, it's not monarchs, it's not suffragettes, it's not trade unionists, it's this one girl. So using a combination of traditional archival manuscript research and rather ingenious new methods in digital research, Laite persuasively and elegantly lays out Harvey's global significance, even though by all metrics, she should have been a forgotten working class girl who was never supposed to matter on such a stage. So in so doing, she breaks this 1910 moment out of its English, out of its four nations, even out of its imperial framework. There are feminists that move the monograph along, but they're not the feminists we think of when we think of Edwardian suffragettes. There are workers who move the monograph along, but they're not the workers we think of when we think of traditional Edwardian trade unionists. And that is because the world that Lydia Harvey and the other 5 figures that form the backbone of the book, their lives are truly global. Laite has made microhistory matter to global history, and global history matter to microhistory. So just when I thought that British historians had eked all of the historical significance out of that fateful year of 1910, Laite has found an entirely new way to contextualize this lurch into modernity. She does so by digging far below the level of the nation state, to the city, to the suburb, to the family, and far above its reach, to international policing, to the communication and transportation revolutions, to transnational labor migration. So in sum, the disappearance of Lydia Harvey deserves the widest possible audience within and beyond British history. And I am so excited that we have Julia here, her first talk for an American audience on this book, to tell us a bit more about this story. Thank you, Julia. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for that wonderful introduction that really made me think about how often when I was researching this book, I went, and it's all in 1910. This is just such an incredible coincidence. But of course, it's not really a coincidence, is it? I'm also heartened to hear that you had such difficulty trying to summarize it for my introduction, because I also had difficulty trying to summarize it in a 45-minute talk. What I've decided to do is to give listeners a flavor of the book by introducing some of the story, and then to intersplice that a little bit with the kind of ruminations on methodology that I've been doing during the research for the book and in the article that you mentioned. And so that's what I'll try to do, and hopefully it will give you a flavor of the book, bearing in mind that there's so many other angles I could have taken. And I'm just going to share my screen because I've decided to go with PowerPoint and show you some pretty pictures along the way. So, in January of 1910, just a few months shy of her 17th birthday, Lydia Harvey disappeared. She bade farewell to the motley crew at Mrs. Logan's boarding house in downtown Wellington, New Zealand, where young men and women, new arrivals to the city, took their meals together in a threadbare dining room after a long day of work. She wrote to her mother, who had her hands full of children back home in the small provincial town of Oamaru, telling her that she had taken a job as a nursemaid to a rich couple who were bringing her with them to London. She gave notice to Mr. Harlow at the photography studio where she had recently gotten a job, where families in nice clothes and lines of orderly children came to buy the new Kodak cameras and develop pictures of their travels. Then she boarded a brand new steamship with 500 third-class berths and a triple expansion steam engine, which cut through the waves of the Pacific and landed her in Buenos Aires in less than a month's time. Then she seemed to disappear. A working-class provincial girl like Lydia was meant to be a respectable servant in the home of a wealthier woman, scrubbing, cooking, and caring for children for well over 70 hours each week. This was, in fact, why she had first come to the big city of Wellington, joining a small army of women who left rural and provincial towns the world over, traveling sometimes 10 and sometimes 10,000 miles on trains, roads, and steamships to answer the hungry call of the urban middle classes for live-in domestic servants. For more than a century, this had been the natural order of things. Working-class young women were essential fixtures in middle and upper-class households, without whom the wealthy would have to scrub and cook and care for themselves. But as the 20th century dawned, this system was in crisis, and the demand for servants far outstripped the supply. More and more young women were expressing their opinions on domestic service with their feet. Like many others, Lydia was desperate to pull herself out of this low-paid, low-status job, and seizing one of the growing opportunities for young women in shop work, she had landed a post at a photographer's studio. It was a move up, but she still wore plain cotton and on fashionable hats, and her purse was empty at the end of each month. Meanwhile, this new world of travel, luxury, and consumer goods lay just beyond her grasp. She had seen the nice dresses and the fine shoes in the windows of shops and in the tissue-thin pages of catalogs. She had held the cameras and the travel photographs. Each morning, as her commuter train snaked its way to Mr. Harlow's photography studio, she saw the steamships at anchor in Wellington's wide blue harbor, waiting to carry people to Sydney, to London, to New York. As she returned home, she walked among the young women who smoked cigarettes and danced the night away, who kissed young men in corners, who had begun to claim the dangerous, exciting spaces of the city as their own. So when she met a beautiful woman named Marie Vernon and a handsome man called Aldo Cellis, who said they would give her nice dresses and help her to travel, she made the wager of a lifetime. 3 weeks later, a once unaffordable steamship ticket to Argentina was in her hands. Lydia was one of almost 3 million migrants who arrived in Buenos Aires' Puerto Madero in the years between 1887 and 1911. This was Argentina's golden age, a period of economic and population boom fueled by foreign investment, especially British investment in transport, agriculture, and industry, and by territorial and imperial expansion. All over Latin America, in fact, the labor market had expanded rapidly. Immigrants, especially from Spain, Italy, and Eastern Europe, flooded into the cities and towns. In Panama, the boat trains carried passengers, soldiers, and sailors from one ocean to the other, while the nearly completed canal project attracted thousands of single male laborers. In Argentina, the violent seizure of indigenous land by the state had opened up Las Pampas, the fertile grasslands of the interior, to a new style of ranching and farming that hungered for seasonal male labor. At exactly the same time that advances in refrigeration on steamships meant that fresh Argentinian beef and pork could reach the tables of Europe and the Pacific. Argentina was a meat market. With this huge rise in male labor, it is no surprise that the commercial sex market was also booming. Buenos Aires was one of the epicenters of the global intersection of labor, entertainment, and sex. The Argentine capital had been famous for its association with open prostitution since at least the 1870s, and pimps and prostitutes of various nationalities had flocked there, attracted by the high ratio of male occupants, this huge population of men who came in occasionally from to the urban centers from more rural areas, an enormous immigrant transient population, and an urban tourism center known for its modern, exciting, and racy nightlife. This kind of ultra shiny electric modernity. Amid perennial debates about the best way to manage commercial sex, venereal disease, and criminality, Buenos Aires had by the late 1880s become home to one of the most infamous regulated prostitution systems in the world. Infamous and lucrative. It's unlikely that 17-year-old Lydia knew any of this, but she must have known upon arrival that she was far from home. As she joined the crowds on the steamship's deck, she could see an enormous metropolis, a city that could eat Wellington whole, stretching out from the crowded port at the end of a muddy estuary. She thought the ship was going to run headlong into another. There were more vessels here than she had ever seen, ships moored to other ships, stacked 2 or 3 deep along the wharf, the smoke from their coal engines spewing into great clouds, the masts of the smaller sailing vessels tangled together in the sky. She must have alighted with her stomach turning in waves of excitement and dread. But when the handsome man and the beautiful woman met her beneath the Buenos Aires sun, their masks began to slip. She was taken out into the shining, pulsing city to buy nice dresses, and a woman came to their apartment and bleached her hair blonde. She was shown how to put on makeup, and then she was forced to sell sex to old and disgusting men in the city's notorious Teatro Casino. Sorry. There's Buenos Aires in 1910. It's literally 1910. Speaking of the insignificance of 1910, this was also the centenary year of Buenos Aires. So it was all dressed up in lights in 1910. So she was taken to the Teatro Casino, where she contracted a sexually transmitted infection. And after a police raid on the illegal brothel that her traffickers were running, she was dragged to London, locked in the stateroom of a steamship. 6 harrowing months later, Lydia was finally found in London by Metropolitan Police detectives, shivering in a hand-me-down dress and trying to catch the eye of passing men under the electric lights of Piccadilly Circus. They brought her back to Great Marlborough Street Police Station, and here she told her story, or at least the parts the police wanted to hear and the parts that she elected to reveal. Lydia's story, however it was told, unfolded in an era that was obsessed with the idea of the exploited prostitution of young white women. The public was hungry to read such melodramatic, sexualized stories of innocence and ruin, and books with titles like From Dance Hall to White Slavery and The Girl Who Disappeared became early 20th century bestsellers. To the authors of cheap novels and newspaper exposés, Lydia Harvey was another bit of fodder for a salacious plot or an eye-catching headline. To those who campaigned for better laws and policies to rescue and reform trafficking victims, Lydia Harvey was a morality tale. In the eyes of moralizers and sensationalizers alike, Lydia Harvey was a girl. That is, an unmarried, working-class young woman who was dangerously unformed. Girls like Lydia were in need of protection and control in this new modern age, in order to prevent them being lost to the twilight world of vice and prostitution. Early feminists saw girls like Lydia a little differently. To women's suffrage campaigners whose movement was gaining strength at the same time as she crossed the Pacific, the Lydia Harveys of the world were at the sharpest end of gender inequality. They were the ultimate victims in a society where women were given no political say and where iniquitous economic systems forced girls to choose, as is illustrated in this suffrage postcard, between the hardships of exploited labor and the miseries of prostitution. To the London police, meanwhile, Lydia Harvey was seen as a tool to be used to prosecute her traffickers, who were, quote, beasts in human clothing and fiends in the shape of a man. The most despised of all criminals, which all kinds of detective autobiography makes really clear. They all hated traffickers more than any other criminal. But Lydia Harvey and others like her were also considered by them to be part of a legion of inveterate liars, one of the women who walked slowly down the West End pavements night after night. To those who sought to rescue girls from these lives of prostitution, meanwhile, Lydia was a project, a creature to save and reform. And to the traffickers who followed her as she walked the London streets, whose real names were Antonio Carvelli and Veronique White and Alessandro de Nicotera, she was a willing, if naive, ally in their bid to get rich in one of the world's most lucrative underworld industries. Inside the stories other people told about her, the real little Lydia Harvey disappeared again and again. She was no one. Who she was, what she wanted, what happened afterwards, none of this mattered. She joined a legion of missing girls, whose brief appearances in newspapers and books remained totally uncomplicated by their past experiences of poverty, abuse, or their exploitation in other kinds of work. No one took any notice of their dreams, ambitions, or desires. In the hands of newspaper reporters and moral reformers, stories like Lydia's served as cautionary tales for any young working class woman who longed for travel and adventure, for better pay and better working conditions, and if they dared to imagine it, for a life of luxury and romance. The end of the story was always an imagined punishment for girls who had, in the parlance of the time, been ruined. Quote, "Her slavery lasts some 5 or 6 years as a rule," noted one dramatic writer. "And then she is flung out upon the streets, her character gone, her hope dead, her body diseased, to die before long, either in a workhouse or a lock hospital." The missing girls in these ubiquitous stories were condemned to a short life of misery, disease, and degradation. They vanished forever beneath the slime of the underworld and remained, quote, "literally nameless and unknown." I first encountered Lydia Harvey the way that most historians encounter any nobody from the past, filtered, dislocated, and preserved in the imperfect amber of an archive file. MIPO 3/197 at the London, UK National Archives, to be exact. And here's a pretty much the first thing I saw when I opened the file. These pictures. It's quite a thick file, as you can probably see. It was 2008, and she was caught up in my hungry search for all the case files I could find about trafficking as I prepared the manuscript for my first book, Common Prostitutes and Ordinary Citizens. In the end, I used a short anecdote about her and her traffickers to frame one of the book's chapters, my first book's chapters, and to illustrate my arguments about how anti-trafficking law was applied, badly, in the UK in the early 20th century, how it turned largely into a crusade against undesirable migration. And so in this chapter, in this book, she became one of the many prostitutes whose brief anecdotes enriched my analysis and, I hope at least, added meaningful details to a book that was about prostitution. Throughout the book, other women like Harvey appeared and then disappeared in similar ways. Here as an example that proved a rule, there as an exception to a trend. I did this, and most social and cultural historians do similar things, in part because I believed that there was little more I could discover about these women, that I had caught a glimpse of a marginalized person who was caught like a fly, as Jean-Paul Gabriel puts it, between the pages of a larger archive. All I knew was Lydia Harvey's name, her approximate age, and whatever information was contained in her witness statement that she gave in the inspector's room of Great Marlborough Street, London, in July of 1910. I didn't know where and when she was born, who her parents were, how she grew up. I knew that she was repatriated to New Zealand in November 1910, once the trial of her traffickers was over. And I had assumed that she had disappeared from history when the detective inspector in charge of the case relayed the news of this repatriation in his final report, placed it in the thick file, and closed the cover. In her book, Imperfect Histories, Anne Rigney notes the importance of anecdotes in communicating the unknowability of history, especially when discussing the vast majority of people who have left few or no ego documents behind. These people, as Rigney points out, quote, can only incidentally be revealed in a negative way by anecdotes or faits divers in which they are the normally hidden routine is for some reason disrupted and hence recorded. The glimpse, says Rigney, becomes a methodological principle. Our ability to discover anything at all about the obscure, humble, and marginalized individuals in the past inspires fascination. As John Arnold writes, there is little more seductive in social history than the promise of access to the voices of those normally absent from the historical record. But this fascination, this seduction, always exists in productive tension with our inability to discover everything about them. About Minocchio, we know many things, Ginsberg writes in that famous work of microhistory, The Cheese and the Worms. About Marcato or Marco and so many others like him who lived and died without leaving a trace, we know nothing. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about Hugh, writes Jonathan Spence in another example, is that we know anything about him at all. The boundlessness of the past has always been kept in check, not only by the boundedness of the archive and the library, but by our own cognitive and physical abilities to identify, search, collect, and connect records. This, argues Anne Rigney, is where history meets the sublime, where historians concede and accept the limitations on their ability to know, comprehend, and represent a boundless past. So, what happens now that our ability to chase so many people out of the bounded archive has become so much greater, faster, and finer grained? Thanks to digitization. This book is, in part, an experiment in trying to answer that question. What would happen, I thought, if I chased Lydia Harvey off the archives page, if I tried to give her a beginning and an end, if I radically recontextualized her within her own life and her own world, instead of using my glimpse of her in a moment of duress as the organizing structure of the story I wanted to tell and the argument I wanted to make? What if she did more than walk briefly across my historical stage? How could I mobilize this new wealth of digitized, character searchable historical records, mostly generated by the family history industry, to enable this new approach? To use a very technical methodological term, I started poking around. And I poked around for about 5 years. My first re-encounter with Lydia Harvey was on an actual rather than a metaphorical stage. In a tiny column in the Oamaru Mail, located by careful character searching, there she was, the girl I thought I could know nothing more about, winning a silver bracelet as the runner-up in a beauty contest at the town's brand new opera house in 1909. From there, I collated hundreds more glimpses, found new archive files through focused searches, and also through sheer serendipity. Piecing these together with genealogical data, immigration records, steamship manifests, and more, I was able to trace Lydia Harvey and her trafficker's journey from Oamaru to Wellington and then on to Buenos Aires and London. I used novels, short stories, and local histories to illuminate the texture of where she lived and how she worked. I also went physically to as many places as I could. This research was done mercifully before COVID struck. And I used old photographs and maps laid like a palimpsest upon new streets and buildings. I found her marriage certificate in a moment of great triumph and confusion, because on it she claimed that her father had been a New Zealand Supreme Court judge. And then I spent hours in the Cambridge Law Library looking up lists of New Zealand Supreme Court judges to no avail. I finally discovered the truth about her family in the partially preserved magistrates' court records for Oamaru that was in New Zealand. Scribbled on the page, her mother's name, taking Harry G.C. Harvey, a local solicitor and the son of a district judge, to court for non-payment of a child maintenance order. So that was her mother taking her father to court because he refused to pay maintenance for his bastard child, Lydia. And thanks to Chris Mitchum at the Waitaki District Archive in Otago, I even found a photograph of Lydia Harvey, a school photograph, which encapsulates the sublime pain of all I still cannot know. Here it is, and here's the painful part. I don't know which girl she is. I know she's in this picture, but I don't know who she is because the picture isn't labeled completely. I later learned that Lydia did well enough in school, but did not distinguish herself as a scholar. As the oldest child in a family of 7 daughters, there were likely more pressing things to do than study. And then in 1909, when she was 16 and finishing her schooling, her mother felt the familiar flutter in her belly once again. In May that year, there would be twins. Lydia was the eldest of what was soon to be 9 daughters. This set of twins meant that she would be practically the mother of one. More nappies to boil and peg out on the line, more pots to scour, more mouths to feed, more bodies crowded into her bed. She loved her sisters, I'm sure, but if she stayed, she would surely disappear. The beauty contest, sponsored by the Oamaru Mail, promised, however briefly, to take her miles away from the washing, the nappies, and the chores. These contests, much to the chagrin of moral reformers, had rapidly become a regular feature in early 20th century girlhood, and small towns like Oamaru were no exception. And this brief adolescent moment reveals precious details about Lydia's life and the world in which she lived, isolated in one way on the South Island of New Zealand, marvelously connected in others. Lydia may have been living in a small town far flung from the great seats of the European empires, but the technological changes in transportation and communication that had swept the globe from the mid-19th century meant that the world was at her doorstep in a way it had never been before. New film technologies meant she could practically reach out and touch a London omnibus. Improved telegraph and postal systems meant she could read the latest news from England, not that late. Richer young women, those who had wealthy fathers who recognized them and who enjoyed life in the upper crust of New Zealand society, could even send a message instantly to friends abroad or use catalogs to order clothes, creams, and other luxuries from around the world. Poor young women like Lydia were left to imagine doing the same. Steamships were faster and more comfortable, and just as importantly, cheaper than ever before. Travel lay within or just beyond the grasp of the average working person, depending on their luck and their circumstance. And so it was easy for Lydia to dream of setting off on one of these floating cities. It was her mobile world, and I did my best to travel it on her terms. But her terms of engagement with this world were limited. She was the eldest bastard child of 9 bastard children. Her father was of some use to her in the form of child payments when he was alive, but he was no use to her at all when he died in his 32-room mansion in Christchurch in 1909. So this is her father's house, in which she never set foot. His estate made no mention of a bastard child. The maintenance payments dried up, the twins were born, and Lydia Harvey did what hundreds of thousands of other girls did. She left home and went into service. That same year, the New Zealand Servants Union was formed. Their key demand? A 68-hour work week. That was their demand. But the union was disbanded by the government before this demand was met, and it remains unmet in global labor standards right up into the present day. From 120 years distance, Lydia Harvey tells us that it's useless to consider women's exploitation and prostitution without also considering their exploitation in other forms of work. She also tells us that desire is at least as important as desperation when poor girls make hard decisions about their lives. 6 months in Wellington saw her find a new job and leave her domestic service post in the boring suburbs behind. She shared a room in a lodging house in the excitement of the racy downtown. She found herself a beau. She snuck out the window at night. She met the people she knew as Aldo Cellis and Marie Vernon when she was introduced by a fellow lodger. You'll have nice dresses and not want for anything and be quite happy, they promised her. If you do as I do, said Marie, and see gentlemen. With pennies in her purse and stars in her eyes, she agreed. Unknowns are, as I said, a fundamental part of any history, and they always exist in productive tension with the narrative. But ultimately, they also became a barrier to me being able to narrate a story entirely from Lydia's point of view. But again, this turned into a kind of blessing in disguise. I began to wonder how the case might be further illuminated by applying the same technique to the people she encountered along the way. The man and woman who trafficked her, the police who prosecuted the case, the journalist who broke the story, and the social worker who ran a safe house in which Lydia stayed while awaiting trial. And so the book became a polyvocal history, or a history in the round, as I've also called it. And it turns out the man Lydia knew as Aldo Cellis had a story of his own. It took me a while to find him. Oops, here he is. Here he is. Here he is in 2 different incarnations, once in 1901 and another time in 1910. The 1910 one is the one with the mustache. He had a story of his own. It took me a while to find him. He was adept at self-reinvention. And to this day, I'm not sure if I found all of his pseudonyms. It's 14 and counting right now. But I do know, after a lot of searching, that he was born Antonio Adolfo Carvelli in Turin in 1879, and that he was an ideal modern boy. He was the son of a maestro de musica. He was classically trained in opera, spoke 6 languages, and spent some time in the military in the officer class. But he too had desires that his life could not accommodate. A major theft saw him flee Italy in 1901 before he was caught and reinvent himself in Australia, first as an opera singer, then as a hotel barber, which is somebody who dresses up and pretends to be a hotel patron and acts like he's a gentleman, waits for people to leave the hotel and then goes upstairs and breaks into their rooms. So a kind of con man thief. Next, he became a colorful entrepreneur in Australia's Wild West gold rush. Then finally, he was a pimp in the gold fields. He profited immensely. His suits were tailored, his fingers were heavy with gold. And it was here that he met his wife, Veronique White, who had come to the Wild West to mine the miners. selling sex to the mostly Italian mine workers in Australia's deepest gold mine, owned by the magnate and later American president, Herbert Hoover. Veronique White, later Carvelli, is another person who defies any attempt to predict her through stock historical characters. She was not, as one might expect, a poor woman who fell into prostitution out of desperation. She was middle class, beloved by her family, well-connected and self-assured. She also demonstrates how easy it was to slip out of view of the authorities and historians alike. She escaped back to New Zealand before the trial and was referred to in court simply as a woman unknown. And her story, which I wish I had more time to talk about because it really is a great one, her story reveals another facet of sexual labor in this age of consumption and globalization, and the complexities of a woman who occupied the uncomfortable position of both victim and perpetrator of abuse and exploitation. It was these precise complexities that caused the police so much trouble in their attempt to investigate and prosecute Lydia Harvey's case. Detective Inspector Ernest Anderson, so far as I can tell, did his absolute best to bring Antonio Carvelli and Alessandro de Nicotera, his accomplice, to justice. Not only had they trafficked Lydia Harvey and another girl from New Zealand, but with each other's help, they'd also brought 3 young women over from France. And Ernest Anderson wrote in his case file, "Never have we had brought under our notice 2 more despicable ruffians." But Anderson knew that the case would hinge on one crucial fact. A successful charge of trafficking required that a woman not already be a common prostitute or of known immoral character, in order to meet the requirements of idealized victimhood required by the law. And the girls who Carvelli had trafficked largely failed on this score. Seeing the case through Ernest Anderson's eyes allows us to see the space between narratives about trafficking and the laws used to control it. And even more crucially, the space between these laws and how they were applied on the ground. And I think by turning this biographying microhistorical eye upon individual officers and considering Ernest Anderson as a person, I don't have a photograph of him, by the way. I've scoured everywhere. There's no picture of Ernest Anderson. I wanted to push against this tendency that we sometimes have as historians to fall back on understanding the police and policing as monolithic arms of the state. The officers in Lydia's case likely had diverse opinions about prostitution and trafficking, and I know for certain that they had different means of dealing with it. Some were meticulous and moral, others were corrupt and violent. And Ernest Anderson did his best, but his best was never going to be good enough to effect real justice. The idealized victimhood that the prosecution was up against had been established by decades of anti-prostitution campaigns and a growing tide of sensational journalism. It was upon globally circulating narratives of the white slavery panic that Guy Scholefield, the New Zealand Press Association correspondent in London, drew when he reported the trial at the Great Marlborough Street Police Court in July of 1910. Lydia Harvey looked like an ideal victim, white, young, Anglophone, a hard-working girl who had been duped by villains. It was clear that Scholefield, committed to serious but slow social reform, could hardly bear to be the bearer of such sensational news. And, as it turns out, the New Zealand government didn't want anyone to read it. The New Zealand Department of Justice sought an injunction against the newspaper and stopped the story from going to print in order, and this is the infuriating part, in order to give the police time to investigate Lydia Harvey's past and to determine that she was already immoral before leaving New Zealand. So the boyfriend, the sneaking out of the windows. Sir Joseph Ward, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, stood up before Parliament and declared that because Lydia was already a soiled dove, before agreeing to go with the Carvellis, that meant no trafficking had taken place. New Zealand, he reassured his people, was free from white slavery. And whether she was a white slave or a soiled dove, the real young woman who was Lydia Harvey disappeared yet again. Antonio Carvelli's case was sent to the Central Criminal Court, and the trial was scheduled for September 1910, meaning that something had to be done with the less than ideal witnesses in the meantime. And so a well-known social worker, Eileen McDougall, was called in. Oh, hang on a second. I thought I had a picture of her, but I don't. I do have a picture, but I don't have it in my slideshow. So you'll have to keep guessing. So Eileen McDougall had made a poorly paid career out of helping desperate young women, victims of sexual abuse, those pregnant out of wedlock, mentally and physically ill girls who had nowhere else to turn but the horrible workhouse or charity. Using the more plentiful money donated for anti-trafficking efforts, McDougall had established a safe house in Lambeth, London, but its doors were open to a far wider category of victim. McDougall well understood how trafficking as a cause célèbre eclipsed, and in fact erased, the far more common reality of intimate and familial abuse. While McDougall's home took advantage of the large number of charitable donations meant to fight the terrible traffic in girls, the majority of its residents were victims of abuse within homes, schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Unlike the public, who remained more interested in stories of kidnap and trafficking perpetrated by dastardly foreign criminals, Eileen McDougall knew that the most dangerous place for a girl was usually not a railway station or a port or a steamship or even Buenos Aires. It was the intimate and institutional spaces of her daily life, and very often her own home. McDougall was no stranger to injustice, and Harvey's case was no different. She and Lydia sat on the witness bench and watched as Antonio Carvelli and Alessandro de Nicotera pled guilty to a lesser charge, part of a plea bargain that had been struck to ensure that the case would not be lost when the defense revealed the immoral character of his victims. The bargain meant he received a minimal jail term. As they walked through the courthouse's grand entryway, Eileen McDougall glanced up, as she always did, to read the inscription above it. "Defend the children of the poor and punish the wrongdoer" was etched into the Portland stone. Much later, reflecting on more than 20 years of trials like Antonio Carvelli's, McDougall confessed that, quote, "As I sit in court listening to the summing up in these cases, I sometimes wonder why they engraved those big stone letters outside that building." After the trial, McDougall faced the uphill battle of trying to find a government willing to pay Lydia Harvey's 30-pound passage home. 2 months and much back and forth later, a third-class steamship ticket was once more in Lydia Harvey's hands. She returned to New Zealand and, in defiance of those misogynistic moralists who would condemn to misery, disease, and death a girl who had sold sex, she continued to live her life. I discovered that she had adventures, that she married, and I learned how, where, and when she died. But I'm not going to tell you that part because you can buy the book and figure it out. Instead, I'll tell you why I wrote this book and what I hope it has achieved. And I'm going to stop sharing, and then my face is going to get really big. So warning, my face is about to get big. So why did I write this book in this way, and what do I hope it has achieved? Firstly, because we desperately need new stories about sexual labor, trafficking, and exploitation. We continue to live today within many of the legal and ideological parameters set by the early 20th century anti-trafficking movement, where the idea of anti-trafficking as anti-immigration and of rescue and incarceration as punishment predominates. Dichotomies of victim and criminal continue to simplify and efface human and structural complexity. Just as they were in the early 20th century, 21st century newspaper columns are filled with stories of young women who disappear from their home countries and are found in brothels, farmers' fields, and nail bars. We traffic in these stories and we call them awareness campaigns. Ultimately, we are uninterested in trafficking victims as human beings who make complicated choices within systems of global inequality that we are doing little to mitigate. We care little where they came from and why they left home, and still less about what happens to them afterwards. As Carol Vance puts it, these stories, quote, entertain and absolve us. And so we need new stories, I argue, more complex and uncomfortable stories, where victims can also be perpetrators, where carceral anti-migrant solutions backfire and put power into the hands of corrupt state and corporate actors, as well as traffickers, where women are making terribly difficult decisions, where well-meaning systems fail them again and again, and where we reflect critically on our own role in perpetuating the exploitation that makes trafficking possible. But we also need stories. As in, I passionately believe in storytelling as a method in historical scholarship and in discourse more generally. I draw immense inspiration from scholars like Sadia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes, who have found beautiful experimental ways to retell the lives of young Black women who have been almost erased by their extreme marginalization and exploitation. The reason these anti-trafficking organizations were so successful in the past and are so successful in the present is because they are storytellers. They engage in what feminist Rachel Reidner calls the brutal rhetoric of human interest stories. So I argue that we have to fight these overly simplistic stories with more stories, and that a hard-hitting analytical academic history just won't do to change people's thinking on what trafficking looks like and how it can be addressed. At the same time, I'm also trying to challenge the way that historians anecdotalize humble and obscure people in social history. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone. My first book was peppered with such anecdotes. And really, I'm using guilty with my tongue in my cheek because I don't really mean to suggest that these anecdotes are wrong or bad practice. I'm almost certainly going to use them again, these kind of glimpses in future writing. And indeed, I use them for minor characters in the disappearance of Lydia Harvey. This book began to take shape when I got really interested in what would happen if I turned a brief case study, an illustrative anecdote, into a full story. And not just a grain of sand through which we can see a wider world, but an important story in its own right. Not only did that turn out to be possible, but I also think it was incredibly productive. It illuminated a particular nexus of work, migration, exploitation, and lived experience at a global level that I could never have dealt with so holistically had I taken a different, broader, wider, more traditional tack. Finally, some closing reflections on what we're doing when we tell these kinds of stories in history. I've talked a bit about this in my recent article, which is called The Emmett's Inch, Small History in a Digital Age. As I was developing this book project, of course, I read a lot of microhistory and social history, and I really began to notice the way that authors justified their approach. The idea of rescue was pervasive. This idea that we're rescuing people from the condescension of posterity and using history as a form of restorative justice for the dead and gone. But I think I've come to approach these questions a little differently. I am, of course, a rescue worker in this story. I have saved Lydia Harvey from the condescension of posterity, but like the rescue workers in her own time, I never asked her if she wanted to be saved. This ethical issue is solved to a certain extent, of course, by the fact that she is long dead. But I still think I've gained a great deal by critically reflecting on my own role as a historical rescuer and all the baggage that that brings. I remain skeptical, I think, about this idea of restorative justice for the dead and gone, but I have no doubts at all about the power of historical storytelling to change minds and hearts and to advocate for justice in the present. And that's why I tried to find Lydia Harvey, to prove that I could, to prove that it matters, and to signal to all those other stories that also matter, which have unfolded in the past and continue to be lived today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Julia. That was fantastic. It was just the right amount of teaser for everyone to go out and buy the book to see how it all ends. We have a couple questions already up in the Q&A, and I really encourage all of you to take a couple minutes, think about what you might want to ask Julia, and you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring both, and we can have a really robust conversation about the content of the book, but also, as you've sort of hinted at the end, about the sort of stakes and choices of this type of methodology. So I will get started with the chat and the Q&A bubble. So Keith Baker has our first question, which is really about the sort of debate around prostitution in this era. And you can speak about British history, British imperial history, sort of global history. He references the Ripper trial, or the Ripper case, I should say, in particular. So if you could talk a bit more about sort of the debate in this area. The Ripper craze was about 30-ish years before this takes place. So maybe you could also discuss sort of what's changed in the sort of span between the Ripper trial and, sorry, I keep saying trial, case, and Lydia's era, the 1910s. And then also, just as a sort of addition, of course, City of Dreadful Delight, which is a study of the Ripper case, is a foundational work in British women's history in particular. And maybe you could also, not just around the content, but the historiographical intervention, sort of how are you moving this field along in the probably, 20, 30 years between your the publication of City of Dreadful Delight and Lydia Harvey?
Yeah, City of Dreadful Delight, when was that? Gosh,
I think it was early 90s, like 92-ish.
Yeah. Yeah, and if Jack the Ripper had a trial, he probably wouldn't be near so famous.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of, was there a different view on prostitution around this era? People did talk about prostitution, as you might predict, quite differently than we perhaps consider it today. And yet at the same time, these conversations are strangely cyclical. And I think for the uninitiated, if they were to dip into conversations that were happening surrounding sex work or prostitution in around 1910, I think people would be really surprised about how many conversations feel very, very similar to the ones that we're having today. But I think that one thing that's really important to note is that there was no one view on prostitution in this era. It was actually an era when people were incredibly split about what the ideal solution would be. So, and this is condensing a huge amount of historiography into a couple of sentences, but there were groups of people who believed that medically regulating prostitution was the only way forward. So places like Buenos Aires, who put these legalized brothels in place where women had to be regularly inspected for venereal disease, put on registers, dealt with quite punitively if they were found to be suffering from venereal disease or if they disobeyed any of the regulations. There were other people, mostly feminists, who were absolutely horrified at this system. They basically said the state is the pimp. The state should not be licensing vice. This is also against the rights of the women themselves. And they had a completely different view on prostitution. Some of them believed that it needed to be decriminalized, and that people who believed that prostitution was bad were supposed to be working to improve the working lives of women so they wouldn't need to sell sex to survive. Others in that same group who hated regulation felt that prostitution should be criminalized and abolished, that the buying and selling of sex should be made illegal and should be repressed in every way, shape, or form. As you might imagine, none of those three views took precedence. None of those three views, even when marginally implemented, ever actually kind of came to fruition. It was this constant competition. But those, I think, that's the main summary of those three positions. And I think what I try to do in my work, sort of vis-a-vis the wider historiography, is really look at the space between what people were saying ought to be done, what ended up getting legislated, and then what actually happened. What happened on the street, what happened when the police had to implement these laws, what happened to the commercial sex industry once these different kinds of legal systems were put in place. The answer is almost always ironic, as in the opposite of what people were hoping to have achieved. And overwhelmingly, prostitution is being pushed all over the world. Overwhelmingly, it's being pushed further and further underground and further into the hands of third parties So women are increasingly having to rely on people like Antonio Carvelli to organize their labor in the face of a system that's criminalizing them more and more. In terms of the Jack the Ripper murders, I think it's significant, but actually what's probably even more significant in conversations about prostitution is the maiden tribute of modern Babylon, which is a newspaper scandal from 1885, which, speaking of heralding modernity, William Stead, who wrote this article, who was a firebrand muckraking journalist, invented modern journalism. I think that's not that controversial thing to say, and he invented it with this maiden tribute piece, which kind of exposed very sensationally a network of child prostitution in London. And even though this was in 1885, 3 years before the Ripper murders, it cast such an enormously long shadow. It remains to this day the best globally selling newspaper scandal of all time. And it really set the scene for these kind of stories that I alluded to in my talk of exploited prostitution and kidnapped girls and missing women. So that's a long answer to a short question that still isn't quite long enough, but I'll leave it there.
Great. It looks like our next question is from Bernadette Pruitt. So Bernie has asked basically about the sort of differences along lines of race in this story. So what we know globally about women from Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, women of color from the United States, and the term white slavery, which you sort of get into the sort of racial implications of that term in the book. Sort of what are the origins there, and yeah, if you could basically talk about this sort of the racial meaning of your story.
Thank you so much, Bernadette, for giving me a chance to talk about it, because it's a huge part of the global narrative at the time, and I do touch on it a little bit in the book as well. So I'll start with the second part of the question, which is the term white slavery, because that helps me answer your first question. It's such a deeply troubling racialized term that the scholarship in the field is still trying to come to grips with. It originates as a term, I'll sort of make a long story short. It pops up as a term in various places, but in the context of the late 19th century, it emerges as a term that's being used by trade unionists and socialists to describe the quote unquote wage slavery of white male workers, particularly in the United States. Gunther Peck writes about this in the context of the US very, very evocatively. So it's being used deliberately as a racially charged term, saying, white slavery also exists. And you can imagine all the layers of problematics that come along with that. But as Gunther Peck argues, and as other people have discovered, the term starts to get feminized by the very late 19th century, particularly in Britain, and then it kind of flows back to the United States from Britain, to be a euphemism for prostitution. So it can be so many things. It can be talking specifically about exploited prostitution, exploited migrant prostitution, or it can literally just be used as a euphemism for prostitution. And so people are using it really willy-nilly, but the racialization inherent in it doesn't go away. And so it is being used to talk about, as you say in your question, European and European descended women and girls. But it's also mostly at one point being used to describe Jewish women who are being trafficked from the Pale of Settlement, sort of all over the world at the time. And this was a very real problem. It was a moral panic, but it was also a very real problem. And so they call that white slavery, even as a huge anti-Semitic discourse is going on in the background against the Jewish men who are the traffickers. And Mir Yarfitz, who's just published a great book called Impure Migration, talks about how the discourse of white slavery, and I quote, lightened Jewish women and darkened Jewish men. So I think that's a really good example of how the racialization of white slavery operates in incredibly complex ways. What it also does is totally invisibilizes the experiences of women of color. So it renders them practically unseeable, in a way that the international, as the international, some early internationalists start coming around the table to talk about the problem of the trafficking women and girls, they are exclusively talking about white women. There is so little about women of color who are most certainly being trafficked around the world. What I'm really interested in my work, in this book, but also in other places where I'm kind of writing in a more academic mode, is the way in which white slavery and even trafficking as a term is used to kind of privatize the problem. So they're saying there's these evil traffickers, these underworld criminals, this kind of organized criminal underworld who are kidnapping women and moving them around the world for the sex industry. And that's trafficking, that's white slavery. We, as global empires, are moving women of color around the world into equally exploitative labor situations. But that's not trafficking, that's just labor. That's just us doing what empires are supposed to do, which is plugging labor shortages by moving one colonized people into another colonized space. And so these, Lydia Harvey is traveling the world at the same time that Indian women are being indentured to cut sugarcane in Guyana. So these flows of labor and exploitation are happening all over the world, and the entire concept of white slavery invisibilizes the connections between them. So yeah, it's so complicated, and I'm so glad that you asked that question. And yes, very much so. I think that these racializations are still happening today. I think there's still there's still an invisibilization of the labor and sexual exploitation of women of color, and that it's kind of wrapped up into a wider narrative about migration and illegal migration. So yeah, that's another long answer to a question that I think could have a much longer one.
Oh, it's true. It's so complicated. I actually set an essay for my world history students about this intersection between Indian indentured servitude, the white slavery panic, and Chinese laborers in South Africa, which is all happening at the same time. And it's a hard question to grapple with. And it's so, I wish I had some of my first and second years here so they could hear a real historian say the language around these things is so complex and hard to disentangle.
It really is, but it has real consequences, like words matter.
Yep,
they really do.
Absolutely. All right, our next question is from Amber Godwin, and she has made some connections with some pre-modern history, which is great. We love to see that. And her specific question is one around advice for other aspiring historians wanting to approach history using this storytelling lens.
Oh, that's a great question. What is my advice? I mean, it's funny because I was just speaking to a PhD student earlier today about using creative techniques in her PhD dissertation, or thesis, I think, as you would call it. And it's an interesting debate because in some ways, you're expected to go through quite academic motions when you're preparing, work for assessment. So in some ways, you kind of have to do the more like traditional academic stuff early, and then it's only kind of later on in my work that I felt like I can get more creative and use more storytelling approaches. That being said, I think there should be so much more scope for that earlier on in historians' careers. And I think one piece of advice is to just go for it, and to draw inspiration from microhistory, because microhistory provides that methodological justification and hook. When what you really want to do is tell a story, but you can't just tell a story because you have to prove you're doing serious history. I think microhistory is a beautiful methodology for that. I do get a little bit annoyed that microhistory is constantly having to talk about whether or not this person's representative, and what does this story tell us about something bigger. But I think that's something that just comes naturally when you start to tell a story. The other great thing about microhistory is the way that it plays with scales. And so that's something I think that I do quite a lot in this book, hopefully well. And I think that's a wonderful thing to experiment. So you start with the story and you zoom in and you zoom out. You kind of act like what Tim Hitchcock calls a macroscope, a lens that can see the very, very small and then zoom out and see the very, very big. And I think working with that, playing with scales, and there's some great scholarship. I think there's an article called Playing with Scales, actually, That's another thing I'd invite you to think through, the way that historians switch between the small and the big. Not quite an answer to your question, other than just general enthusiasm. I think even if you don't end up then using that storytelling in some kind of formal piece of work, I think there's something so useful about thinking about telling what you're, like, sort of thinking about what you're doing as a story, and just using that as a thought experiment, if nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. And listening to things like podcasts, the medium we use to communicate history now has changed so much that there are people that are working in sort of these native storytelling, you know, in the media. So there's a lot out there, a lot of models.
Yeah, and in general, just, you know, because I think there are, you know, I think people are less, serious academic historians are less hostile to these kinds of more crossover books and books that attempt to draw in a wider readership than they used to be. But I think there is still some hostility and snobbery around it. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, it's just about being unapologetic about wanting to write history that people read. That's one thing that I've just, this is my first trade book. So before this, I've published books with academic presses, and it was just such a wonderful experience to work with an editor who had this broad readership in mind, and to know that, you know, my book would reach a much wider readership than it would otherwise. And so, yeah, that was just really heartening. And I think there's a degree of just don't apologize, just do it.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to combine two questions because they both sort of speak to the present stakes of Lydia's story and also kind of thinking through hypotheticals. So Jalen's question, Jalen Garcia, how you feel that today's justice system would have made a difference if this case, and of course cases like this are brought before the criminal justice system all the time, but also Keith's question about the changes that we can make as you see it as a historian. So issues like those of Lydia Harvey, maybe there's more justice that can be served there.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the justice system, I guess it sort of depends on which justice system we're talking about. I don't know the current American justice system particularly well, but I do know that there are very, very different sort of policies and practices in terms of trafficking in different states. I know that states tend to have very different approaches. Some states use the letter of the law. Other states use prosecutorial policy to get around it. So I think my answer will probably have to bear on the UK, where I know the law far better. I don't think today's criminal justice system would have made any difference at all to the case because, well, for one, Lydia Harvey would have been if she had come to the UK from New Zealand and worked, she would have been considered an illegal migrant in the present day. So if anything, the space in which somebody is legally allowed to be a victim of trafficking is even smaller now than it was in 1910. And so the vast majority of victims in the UK, if you claim to be a trafficking victim, or if the authorities identify you as a potential trafficking victim, you know, when they raid a brothel or a nail bar, there's something called the National Referral Mechanism. And you're sent through that, and they assess whether or not you're a real victim of trafficking, or if you're just another one of these nasty economic migrants trying to cheat the system by saying you're a victim of trafficking. If you get through that national referral mechanism, which not many people do, and are identified as a trafficking victim, then you get the grand old prize of a few months in a hotel room, long enough for you to testify against your traffickers. And then if you're really lucky, you may get a 6-month visa to stay in the UK, but most of the time you're immediately deported after the trial. So that's today's justice system. It's also a justice system where we are now seeing some of the lowest rates of successful prosecution for any sexual offenses. And so, you know, if I was given the opportunity to change the law, which I think relates to Jalen's and Keith's question, I would just say we don't need a special law against trafficking. What we need is for the laws we already have to be applied fairly and justly. Because the issue is that, you know, what Lydia Harvey suffered was a form of sexual abuse and assault. And we know that thousands of women inside and outside sex suffer that today. And we know that the vast majority of these cases go unreported. When they are reported, they're not taken seriously. When they're taken seriously, they don't make it through the courts. And so that's the change that we need. We need a justice system that can adequately deal with the epidemic of sexual violence in our societies.
Absolutely. Well said. So the next question is from Jadwiga Biskupska, who would like you to sort of put prostitution as a particular line of work or a choice that you make in the course of a lifetime into context. Sort of, if you could talk about these, Lydia, but also maybe some of the other women in the story, sort of their broader lives in work.
Yeah, so this idea of prostitution kind of stigmatizing them as well, and how that's in context. Yeah, and I was kind of sad that I felt like I didn't quite have enough time to talk about Veronique White or Veronique Carvelli, because her part of the story in some ways acts as a foil to Lydia's part, because she was somebody who did engage in selling sex more willingly and did continue to do it for a long time in her life. In fact, there's this one amazing moment in the archive when she's applying to naturalize as a New Zealand citizen, because she's Australian, and then she becomes Italian when she marries Antonio, and then she wants to become a New Zealander. And so the police are investigating her to make sure she's an upstanding citizen. They discover that she had sold sex for years and years, and they discover that they're pretty sure she was involved in trafficking women in New Zealand about 20 years before. And the police officer says, oh, but I spoke to her and she told me that she made so much money, she never needs to work again in her life. And so she's gone straight. So she's fine, we can give her citizenship. And just, it was just this wonderful confluence of seeing this woman who was just incredibly wealthy and well off, and had made more money than she could ever have possibly made in another industry. But also seeing, the police officers who, you would have expected to stigmatize her in a very quite legal way, saying, nah, she's fine. And so it really kind of throws up these ideas about the stigma of prostitution and the way that women who sold sex were kind of put outside of their communities up in the air. And it's the same story with Lydia Harvey. I'm trying not to do too many spoilers, because I know it's funny to say spoilers. It's like, this happened 100 years ago. How can you spoil? But she does get married. She does have incredible adventures and what seems like a very loving relationship. And there is a point in that final chapter where I say, I wonder if she told him. Did she tell her husband what had happened to her? Did he tell her about his experiences with commercial sex? He was a sailor, so I'm just absolutely positive that he would have at least encountered prostitution, and he probably bought sex. And so telling the story in this micro level really forced me to think about how the kind of stock expectations of what's supposed to happen to a stigmatized person often don't work out that way, and that people are incredibly resilient, and that society and relationships are really complex. And so what I was seeing for everybody in the story, including the trafficker, including Veronique, including Lydia, was that they were moving in and out of illicit and licit work, of respectability and unrespectability, in this incredibly mobile world where they could constantly reinvent themselves. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think that's an answer to your question, a possible answer to your question. Oh yes, was this only possible because she returned to New Zealand? I think that mobility had something to do with it, right? So that, if things got too hot, if you felt too stigmatized or what have you in one place, you could so easily move to another. And so, that helped. But at the same time, I just think that societies were a little bit more malleable and forgiving than we might give them credit for. Lydia's mother was had, like I said, 9 children out of wedlock. She had 9 children without a father in sight, which was actually quite statistically incredible for this time. And yet she was a music teacher in the community. So presumably people were sending their kids to take music lessons with her. She wasn't this sort of person that people threw rocks at as she walked down the street. And so I think we have to be careful not to assume this kind of totality of stigma when we think about people in the past and at this time.
Yeah. And also, I mean, they're moving between legal systems, but the legal systems are also changing, because correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm misremembering, but the law around brothel keeping in New Zealand changes over her lifetime there, right? It changes after she comes back. So originally you could legally keep a brothel if it was just a one-woman establishment. And then that during the First World War, that is no more, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Throughout this whole period. So the story in terms of the life courses of everybody in the story runs from about 1879 when Antonio Carvelli is born to 1964 when Veronique White dies. So they're the kind of oldest and youngest, oldest people in the story. And the amount of legal change surrounding prostitution at this time is just incredible. So they are literally having the regulations change out from under them. So the reason they leave the Wild West of Australia and go to New Zealand is because they're starting to crack down on like free prostitution and the Wild West, but they've just made this loophole in the law in New Zealand that allows them to run these one-woman brothels. But then by 1917, the one-woman brothels are now illegal. I don't know if anyone noticed the two pictures of Veronique White. There's the one very lovely one, which is her wedding photograph. And then there's one where she's looking significantly more harried, and that's a prison photograph, because she was caught in 1917 and charged with running a brothel. And she tried to get out of it by saying, but I didn't know the law had changed. It didn't work.
Okay, I'm gonna actually jump down to Catherine's question because it follows on a bit from what we're already talking about, but also I want to make sure everyone gets at least one question answered. So Catherine Chuchmuch asks, did you discover more about Lydia's character through her own actions or from other people's narratives about her?
I think the former. So it's funny that you should say actions, because I think quite a lot about this, because I, for some reason, insist on writing histories of people who never wrote a word. I don't know why I do that. It feels like it would be much easier if I just sort of picked somebody who left an extensive diary, but I just can't get interested in that. I need the challenge. So, I don't know. I don't know what Lydia's character was. And there were points at writing the book where I thought I might not have even liked her. Like we might not have even gotten along. But I do think quite a lot about action in lieu of voice. So, when we don't have a voice, when we don't have somebody, writing their own story, all we have is what they did. And so it was a combination of thinking about what she did, which of course was always built from other people's stories about her. But like Marissa Fuentes says, you read along the biased grain of the archive. And so when the police officer is talking about her immoral behavior, sneaking out of windows and stuff like that, I tried, and I think I gave, that was the bit I gave the most flavor of in the excerpt that I read. I tried to really place that in the context of what it was like to be a 16-year-old girl in Wellington in 1910. So, every time I encountered one of these stories that were being told about her, I tried to flip it and think, okay, but what would it have been like to have been her? And the other thing that I did was just really, really deep contextualization. So I just got a bit obsessed, really. Like I rode the train that she would have taken to the photography studio in the suburb. I found where her lodging house was. I walked to the brothel that the Carvellis were running. I even at one point got caught outside somebody's house in Australia, in Melbourne, taking pictures of the house because it was a house that I knew one of the people had lived in. And they found me outside and actually invited me in. And so then I got to see the interior of the house, and I was able to describe that in the book. And so it was stuff like that, like focusing on materiality and action, that helped me build a sense of Lydia's character. But I think that any reader will notice a space in the middle that is Lydia, that is still an absence. And part of the book is about inviting the reader to think about who she may have been, and the fact that we can't know who she really, really was. So yeah, that's I don't know if it's quite, yeah, I think that's basically what I did. It's always going to run up against the fact that I just don't know who she is. But I tried my best.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about this gap, even though the way that the book is structured, we're reading the same material a lot because it is told from these 6 different perspectives. And I was wondering, sort of, obviously her story should bookend the chapters. But why did you choose in the middle there, the structure that you did? Did you want the reader to take anything away from those choices? Was it simply that sort of lifespan that you talked about, going from who was born first to who died last, and then Lydia on the ends? Or how did you sort of walk us through your choices for actually structuring this history in the round, as you called it?
That's a great question, because it changed so much. And actually, this is a place where I really need to nod to my editor, Louisa Dunnigan, at Profile, who, because it's a trade press, they actually really, really work with you. And we talked a lot about structure. So I actually had the chapters in a different order originally.
Okay.
And then we kind of switched them around so that the story could move through the characters. So each time I changed a character, it also furthered a bit of the narrative. So you saw different points of the story through these different eyes. And in the end, yeah, so I think we have Lydia, and then we have what me and my editor took to calling the goodies, as in the police, the newspaper reporter, and the social worker, and then the baddies, as in the traffickers, at the end. And it just felt like it worked. In terms of doing it in the first place, in terms of the history and the round bit, and why I decided to do it that way. It wasn't, in my talk, I said it was because I couldn't know enough about Lydia, but I'm pretty sure I probably could have stretched it out, or I could have made it about just Carvelli and Lydia, because they're the two kind of richest characters in a way. But I just really loved the idea of insisting that it's not just people like that who could benefit from this kind of biographical, microhistorical treatment, that the other people in the case, if I did the same technique to them, that new things would get revealed, and they did. And actually, my favorite character in the whole book is Eileen McDougall.
Mine too, absolutely.
Came in on the side, and I didn't see her coming, and then all of a sudden, she was just this incredible force in the story. So yeah, I'm really glad I did it that way, but it makes it damn hard to explain what the book's about. It's about 6 different people, but not really.
I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to circle back to these last 2 questions. If you have any other questions for Julia, please type them in the Q&A. Otherwise, these will be the last 2. So we have another question from Amber, and she wants to know about the role of the Arabic diaspora in these flows of labor and transit in Latin America. Because of course, Buenos Aires was not just a sort of European expat community at this time. There was also that sort of flows from the Middle East as well.
Yeah, and I don't know near enough about it, and I can't even really point to scholarship that clearly is about that. I do know that there's some work coming up, not coming up, but that has recently been published about trafficking in the Arabic world. So, but I don't know a lot about the Arabic diaspora in Latin America. So I can't really answer the question, I'm afraid. I know that traditionally, in the scholarship on trafficking, they're not mentioned, which is really, really interesting in a lot of ways, because they are racializing and pathologizing different groups of people. But in Buenos Aires, the attention is so firmly fixed on Jewish traffickers, almost to the expense of everyone else, even though actually the majority of traffickers were French in Buenos Aires at the time, the majority of pimps and stuff. But I have not, so in all of the registers of registered prostitutes, there's nobody from any Arab state or colony at all listed. I don't know if that means they're engaged in a more clandestine part of the industry, or if they're just not coming as part of that flow for sexual labor and they're engaged in other kinds of labor. But yeah, so I would have to know the literature on that a lot better than I do to answer that question properly. But they're definitely not visible in the literature on trafficking.
Sounds like an idea for an MA thesis, Amber.
So I was just about to say, I think somebody needs to research that.
Absolutely. And then our final question, we're going to circle back to Keith with another sort of hypothetical. So if we look at this period and we think about what if women and men, before the law had equal rights, do you think the case would have played out differently?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question and like a super counterfactual one because women are still not equal to men in the law globally. So, presuming they were, my comment would be the trial would never have taken place in the first place because Lydia would never have been forced to go and work for starvation wages, 75 plus hours a week, scrubbing toilets and floors, because she would have had more options and more rights, including rights to demand that her father give her some money. And her mother would have had more rights to demand that the father give her more money. And the mother's, so the sort of chain of inequality would be disrupted in that sense. So I think that if women were being treated equal as men before the law at this time, Lydia Harvey would never have experienced what she did. Presuming she still did, I think is kind of difficult to say, isn't it? Because again, the law wouldn't have stipulated that she couldn't have, like, the known immoral character thing. So presumably it would have been a lot easier to prosecute. But I'm so cynical about the possibility of that happening, even in the present day. I can't begin to imagine what a past that was equal would look like.
Yeah, no, and your answer brings up a really interesting sort of question about the interplay between economic rights and political rights, right? Which one do we need first? Which one is more sort of ultimately sort of instrumental in the public sphere? And I think there's an argument, right, for true economic equality in
the money and the vote. The money was at least as important, as Virginia Woolf would say.
Absolutely. Back to Virginia Woolf.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going to finish with Anonymous, who wants to kind of talk about the structure of the book again. So maybe if you could talk through the choices you made, not just in sort of coordination and organization, but how you selected these people. We know that Lydia Harvey jumped off the archive page for you initially, but maybe the other characters that you draw together in the monograph.
Yeah, that's a lovely question, and because it wasn't immediately obvious, and once I started thinking, okay, who are these police officers, I realized how many police files I'd read over years and years and years where I never ever noticed, like never even really took great note at all of the police officer who's writing his name. I was just mining the file for information. And so selecting the police officer was pretty obvious because he's the detective inspector in charge of the case. But in terms of the topic in that chapter, it very much is about how the law falls apart when it meets reality. This law that's born in the ideologies of social moralism and internationalism just completely crumbles when it encounters complex realities. And the newsman, the chapter about the man who's breaking the case in New Zealand, writing for the New Zealand Press Association, was actually not going to be the chapter. I was going to write a chapter about a totally different person, who was the head of the biggest moral reform organization in England at the time, William Coote. But the chapter just wasn't working. My editor thinks it's because I hated him too much. And that is true, but for some reason I couldn't hook him into what I wanted to say about the way that the discourse about white slavery circulated globally and was built on this rise in the tabloid press, because this is all, I didn't emphasize this in the talk, but this is also a story about mass media, and globalizing mass media. And so that was the decision to make it about him. Another name I didn't know until I actually looked. The social worker was just became obvious because she just got involved in the case. And the more I read about her, the more I thought this woman is just incredible and needs to be part of the story. And then I think the other two are pretty obvious. The trafficker, although it's interesting that I did leave out Alessandro Di Nicotera. He's in there. And at one point I thought he was going to get his own chapter, because his story is really different from Antonio Carvelli's. He is more of a kind of poor, criminalized guy who just never manages to make good. He's a more kind of typical pimp in a way. But in the end, he's just part of Antonio Carvelli's chapter. Veronique White, I had no idea I would be able to write a chapter about her, because I thought her name was Marie Vernon at first. And the marriage certificate between her and Antonio there's a serious transcription error that calls her Karanique. And so I wasn't finding it for ages in character searches. And I just did at one point. I just kept misspelling her name until it spatted her out. And then once I found out her real name, I found out so much more about her. But yeah, so those are the characters. And so it was a combination of this character really fits, you know, is an integral part of the story, or this character really helps me say a part of the story that needs to be said.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that, you know, we all struggle with, from the first essays we write as an undergrad up until the books we produce as professional historians. You know, in what order and with what emphasis, right, do we introduce people into our stories?
My advice there is don't be afraid to change things, and
Yes.
like throw things up in the air and let them land back down. Because like 3 weeks before the final manuscript was due, is when I deleted the William Coote chapter and wrote the musical chapter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I terrified my editor, but in the end, she realized it worked. So it was okay. But it was a constant, like up to the nth hour, a process of constantly rearranging and thinking about how the puzzle pieces fit together. I think it's just an integral part of writing, and historical writing especially, right? Because
Absolutely.
we're just trying to shape the data into a story that really means something.
Fantastic. Well, I think you've given us so much to think about, both in terms of, you know, our own writing practices and also this amazing story that, you know I shouldn't say it illuminates so much, right, about all of these bigger topics, because Lydia Harvey is really a big topic in and of herself. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it back over to Ben.
Thanks. What an intellectual feast this was, both moving and powerful and fascinating, everything we could have wanted. So I hope all of you are joining me in giving a digital round of applause to Dr. Laite for that wonderful lecture. Remember to go purchase her book, order through whatever local independent bookstore you prefer.
Actually, it's not available in local independent bookstores in the United States, but it is available on, what's it called? The bookdepository.com, which is not Amazon and has free international shipping.
There you go, the Book Depository. Excellent. Excellent. I'm sure all of you, your appetite is whetted. A reminder to register for our third and final summer webinar series that will take place on August 4th at 7 p.m. With Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed. Otherwise, I hope all of you are having a great summer. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening.